let's talk a little bit about if you should share your sexual fantasy with a partner. There's some sort of divide and maybe how to approach this in the research that I've found.
Working with clients, I've heard actually really positive things from people being on the receiving end of a fantasy, like feeling so connected to their partner and wanting more, where it's like, please, please, like, tell me more. But the person telling obviously feels very
Like,
vulnerable, and they're like,
right,
whoa,
right.
like, take what I gave you, you
Mm-hmm.
know? So I've heard really positive things about it. I haven't heard anything negative, but I'm also like, I'm sure it would be very hard for some people to hear particular fantasies, right? Like if you're in a monogamous relationship, it might be really hard to hear your partner fantasizing about your neighbor.
It's a risky move, I think, and so treating it with caution, I think, is your best approach. Whether or not you decide to share this your sexual fantasy with a partner is probably going to depend on the sexual fantasy is, what your goal is in sharing it, and the quality of your relationship with your partner. Okay, we have Jay here. I wouldn't know how to, unfortunately.
It's
Well,
hard.
it is hard, and perhaps in our conversation tonight, that might give you a little bit more insight. And if you were to decide to, how you might go about that. First, the most important thing is have that understanding of your sexual fantasy. What does this fantasy really mean for you? So you could go with either of the understandings we talked about. Sort of like, it's just something I enjoy, it's just something I'm exploring, it's a preference I have. I'm not going to overthink it, I'm going to respect it and honor it. Or you might dig a little bit deeper and kind of ask yourself, is this representing a need I might have, an insecurity I might have that I would like to address in my real life? So think step
Right.
one, what does this sexual fantasy mean for you? And do you feel like it's bringing you to want to take some action in some way, right?
Right. I completely agree. Like, is this something, can you be fulfilled if it remains a fantasy? Or do you feel like you need to implement it in order to be fulfilled?
Something that I want to normalize. Your sexual fantasies are private. You have a right to privacy. You do not need to share your sexual fantasies with anybody if you choose not to. And sometimes that is the best option. If you want to keep something as your own little private, like pleasurable world just for you, there's nothing wrong with that. There's no pressure to share your fantasies with anybody, which is why first ask yourself, what does this mean for me? And do I feel like it would be worthwhile to consider sharing it?
Yeah, I agree. No pressure. I do think in the right scenario it can be so connecting and fulfilling though as well.
Yes, it can be if if heard and received well,
Yes,
right?
exactly.
So, which is why it can be risky because
Right.
if done properly and if you have a partner that receives it with acceptance and non-judgment and openness, that is incredibly bonding and fosters connection and intimacy.
Mhm.
If you sharing your fantasy is met with judgment and criticism, or that person feels threatened by what they're hearing, or they feel insecure, then that can be pretty detrimental and devastating for somebody.
Mhm.
So it really, you need to consider kind of a few variables before making that decision. And it's ultimately not one that someone can make for you, but it can go one or somewhere even between there. It doesn't have to be like detrimental and devastating or immensely rewarding. Like you might kind of get like a
Right.
okay, and
Yeah.
you know that person might be a little bit unsure of like
Let's
what this.
tiptoe into it, or what does this
Uh-huh.
mean? Like, I need more questions answered, that kind of thing.
It's like best case scenario. Some people actually really get off hearing about their partner's sexual fantasies and they want more and they really enjoy that. That can actually be a really big turn on. So for some people, not for everybody,
Right.
right? For some people, they might see it as a threat. Well, wait a minute, you're fantasizing about something that isn't me and just me and only me, like, and they're really insecure about that. So knowing your partner and maybe like understanding some of the dynamics in your relationship, I think would be important in making this decision. Ask yourself, what's the goal of sharing? Do you want to just like share a part of yourself that you don't normally share with people just for the fostering of connection? You feel safe enough with your partner. I think that a really wonderful way of opening up that conversation would be, I want to share with you a sexual fantasy that I have that I've never shared with anyone, but I finally feel safe enough with you to do that. What an honor it would be to hear that, right? Like,
Right,
really?
right.
You've never shared this with anyone, but you feel safe enough with me? Like, it's such a positive way to start that conversation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if you don't want to be vulnerable about it, right? Like we've mentioned on previous streams about maybe exploring dipping your toes in the water through,
Right.
the craziest thing? Like I had a dream last night. What do you think of that? Right? Like we've talked about that concept as well
The
to
dream
open up the
scheme.
conversation. Yeah.
If you are terrified at the thought
Yeah.
of sharing your fantasy with a partner, yet you want to do that, the dream scheme is a great strategy, what you just shared, Victoria. It comes from Vanessa and Xander Marin's book,
Yep.
Sex Talks, where it's a little bit of a white lie, for being fully honest, but a dream and a daydream fantasy, tomato, tomato. But you say to your partner, yeah, I had the weirdest dream last night. We had a threesome. And isn't that weird? Isn't that kind of crazy? And then you're testing the waters, right? It was actually kind of like really like sexy, and see how your partner kind of responds. Like, it kind of got me thinking about it. It's one way to open the door, right?
Absolutely.
And so that might be a way to approach a conversation if you're hoping to maybe actually implement your fantasy into
Yep.
your real life sex life, right? That could be one way to introduce it. The other thing is you could just start by talking about the topic of sexual fantasy in general with your partner. And this brings circling back to what's your fantasy, right?
So
Is like,
broad.
like 18th century New England, and like that pressure of like, I got to deliver. Not only do I have to say something really specific and sort of out of the norm, but I also have to guarantee that I would love it if we did it. And so instead, you could ask something like, what are you curious about? Is there anything you're curious about trying sexually, or just curious about sexually, even if you're not interested in trying it? And be prepared to answer that question yourself.
Yeah.
Because usually you get asked that back. Like, oh, I don't know. Like, I guess I hadn't thought about it.
Right.
I don't know. I think like sex on a beach would be kind of fun. What about you, right? Be prepared to share, what your fantasy is that you would like to share.
Right. And usually people do feel more comfortable being vulnerable if you're leading with vulnerability.
Yeah. Yeah, it kind of fosters, like it's contagious, right? Vulnerability fosters vulnerability. Okay. Another way that you can introduce this topic of fantasy, as well as maybe trying something a little new or different in your relationship, is to use a yes, no, maybe list.
I love that idea.
It's a list where you go through listed different sexual behaviors, and you circle yes, you'd be willing to give that a try, no, you would not, and then maybe. And you kind of compare your list with your partner and see where you aligned up. You toss the no's and you consider, do we have any shared yeses? Do we have any shared maybes?
Yeah.
And then you can spend some time kind of exploring that. The other thing I think is it's important to not judge yourself. If you're worried about your partner judging you, first and foremost, we ultimately can't control how somebody responds to us, despite your best efforts, despite you feeling like, I think this will be well received. If you're met with some judgment or some criticism, your best defense against that is for you not to judge yourself. It's for you not to see yourself as a weirdo, broken, something's wrong with me, and just kind of tell yourself, this is, you know, I'm not hurting anyone. This is just my fantasies in my own mind, and I'm allowed to have my own private world, and I can
Right.
go any place I want to go, and it's not going to be for everyone. Not everybody is going to share the same fantasy or find the same things arousing that I do.